Hello, and welcome to this evening's UCSF Virtual Alumni Program, UCSF Alumni Author Series, a conversation with Jenny Key, PhD. My name is LJ Moore-McClelland, and I work as a health professions education specialist in the School of Medicine at UCSF. I'm a writer, a naturalist, and a mixed media artist, and have published books of poetry and illustrated flash fiction. I am a huge fan of Jenny's work. Jenny and I met when we were both members of the Parnassus Poets Group at UCSF, which is run by David Watts, MD. Before we start today's program, I would like to review a few housekeeping items to help with your experience. If you'd like to submit a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A box. Please keep your questions brief. And given the size of the audience and the number of questions, our speakers may not be able to answer everything, but we hope you enjoy the conversation. Our author tonight, Dr. Jenny Key, received her PhD in biomedical sciences from UCSF, where she studied novel drug candidates in preclinical models of pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors. She currently works with life science and biopharma groups as a competitive intelligence manager with a focus on ovarian cancer. The reason we are here tonight, however, is to applaud Jenny as the author of Focal Point, winner of the 2020 Steel Toe Books Poetry Award. Her essays and poems have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and elsewhere, and she received fellowships and support from Tin House, Omnidon, Kearney Street Workshop, and the San Francisco Writers Grotto. We wanted to hear more about Jenny and her debut poetry book. Welcome, Jenny.
All right, thank you so much, LJ. So as LJ mentioned, my name is Jenny Chi, and I'm going to be reading a handful of poems from my from my debut collection, Focal Point, which I'm going to hold up here as well. So I have always kind of liked both science and writing, and have struggled with how to maintain the balance between those two things. I wrote most of this book during grad school, actually, while I was at UCSF. My mother passed away shortly before I started my program. I was in the biomedical sciences program in the grad division. And while I was a grad student, I had just few ways of grappling with my grief. And so I turned to poetry. So I will just go ahead and jump into some poems here. The very first poem, I'm going to start with the very first poem. And the title is The Definition of a Focal Point in Optics. This is point at which parallel waves converge and from which diverge. Researcher, prevention won't save my life, tweets a patient with metastatic cancer. I'm reminded of my mother. Why don't you want to study cancer? When I expressed interest in HIV. In the hospital, call from a professor. My mother clapping once, then silence. The roommate 30 years her senior, who called my voice lovely, who called my mother lucky, whom I resented because she outlived my mother. Nights at a microscope in a dark room where the lights turn off after 10, sitting too still, turning a knob just so to focus on the right field of cells. The 800 mice I've sacrificed this year, injecting cancer, harsh medicine into their soft, warm bodies. hating them for biting me, but understanding, stroking their white fur in apology, covering cages with paper so they can't watch their sisters die. But I can. And I see my mother in those graying eyes I refuse to donate because how would she see? And I think how cruelly futile all this erratically focused empathy, how brutal to learn why I couldn't save what I couldn't save. I should mention that that very first poem, I have it sort of offset. So my book is divided into 4 sections, and this precedes all 4 of the sections. And I kind of view it almost as comparable to an abstract in like a scientific paper. The next poem I'm going to read, I wrote after my first year of grad school. I think at the end of my first year, I became very, very ill. And that is all the intro I need for this poem. Normal. 18 months after you died, I spent a week in a hospital bed. Nurses whispered, how strange, pneumonia in someone so young and normally healthy. Alone at night, I cried, Mama, is this how you felt? Hauling a collection of cords out of bed, tripping, gripping the walls like a wounded animal to get to the bathroom, brush your teeth, needing to do something normal. I ran 5 miles the day before I collapsed. Months after my discharge, I inch up a slight hill, stop every few steps gasping. At the top, I cough so hard I throw up. I cried in the hall last night, remembering how you used to walk faster than me, how you stopped every few steps, waited for my stubby child legs to catch up. After your lung surgery, I was the one waiting. Mama, I finally get it. Why those surgeries broke you. Why you were so cross about living, even as you did everything to live. But at the same time, I don't, because I'll recover. As you're beginning to see, a lot of the poems in this book are quite sad, so I won't dwell only on the sad poems today. It turns out, as I was putting this book together, I realized I wrote a lot more about science, and metaphors from my science life entered this a lot more than I thought. So I'm going to read some of those next. This next poem is Telomeres and a 2 a.m. love poem. These are the only kind I'll write you when I should be reading about telomeres, how they guard the ends of chromosomes and wane with every breath we take, leaving fragments of ourselves behind as our cells grow and divide and become ever more vulnerable as we grow older. I have this sudden brilliant thought that the chromosomes in our heart cells must have the shortest telomeres of all. And I think how I can only admit that I might tolerate /love you when my science becomes this bleary-eyed, delirious brain mush. These nights, I look at you sleeping and want to press my lips to your forehead, tug a corner of the sheet from beneath your arm, tuck myself in its place. Come morning, you'll be just a heavy arm slung across my stomach, too warm body curled around my spine. But now I think mad thoughts, like how maybe you could be an exception, and how maybe I could do this every night, and how maybe we could let our telomeres shorten together. Next, I'm going to read a series of very short biology lesson poems. So I structured the early parts of this book kind of like a poetic lab notebook. And so these biology lesson poems are interspersed with scenes from my non-biology life. And I wrote these when I was first learning how to do cell culture, because in undergrad, I was in a zebrafish lab, so I didn't really do cell culture until I started grad school. Biology lesson 1. Cells need touch. Isolated cells wither, float away in a blood red sea. Biology lesson 2. Too much touch stifles. Even the toughest cells die wanting room to breathe. Biology lesson 3. Heart cells beat spontaneously in vitro, given proper nourishment. Biology lesson 4. Fed the right factors, cells can become anything. Molecular inspiration. I'm excited to have read those poems to this audience in particular. The next poem I'm going to read was recently appeared in The Atlantic, actually, and it's one that is really special to me and took me a long time to write. It says, Postcards from the Living. I light incense on the stovetop, trail cinders through an empty house. I've decided to believe in the power of ashes. Here I am, buying fruit, mending torn shirts, brushing teeth in cramped bathrooms, living someplace new. Wish you were here. I sprinkle sandalwood dust on the ribbon for my first 5K, the token for my first solo trip. Milestones so small and unremarkable, only you could understand and be proud. Remember world history class, how I translated lectures to you each night, partly to practice, partly to keep you with me. Every day, there's so much new I want to show you, like the spongy tang of injera, pork belly banh mi, melting like butter on the tongue. All these places I have traveled without you, so I can forget how without you I am. Remember when I was 10 and hateful, trying too hard to be cool, how in a rare moment, you said all you wanted was for me to love my life, my only life, this life you started. Here, look how the clouds blush so fiercely, the stark blue winter, so cold and bright. I guess something that all of my classmates know, but maybe not a lot of people know, is that I started grad school when I was pretty young. I was only 20. And so I did a lot of growing up there. The next poem I'm going to read, I wrote after reading a paper on neurons, those habits. My fingers haven't touched ivory in years, but they still remember the first measures of fur release. butterscotch jewels in a neighbor's parlor. Adagio, fortissimo, lamentando, encoded in slender muscle fibers, tugging on tiny ivory bones, building memories with each repetition. Brain cells, like muscles, build connections with repeated stimulation, letting memories scratch across until they live in the grooves. The more you remember, the deeper the scratches, the more you remember, until remembering is habit, like breathing or tying a butterfly knot in the dark. Darkness, too, is a habit, ruminating on sorrow until sorrow is easy as breathing, easier. I think I have time. I'm going to read just 2 more poems. The next poem is Writing Elegies Like Robert Hass. And I guess all you need to know for this is that Robert Hass is a fairly famous poet. Right. Writing Elegies Like Robert Hass. Last night, I heard Bob Hass read an elegy for his younger brother, and I chuckled when he said his brother had the impulse control of a ferret. And I thought of all the elegies I've written for my young mother, who ate only what she liked and scratched bug bites until they bled. And I thought, gee, I wish I could write an elegy to induce chuckling. What I meant was, I wish I could remember her and chuckle. It took me 6 months to talk about her, to admit she was dead. It took another 4 to say dead. It took another 5 months and 13 days and 20 some odd elegies to write how she scoffed. If she had raised that sissy friend of mine, he would have grown a spine. I keep trying to write an elegy for my mother that remembers her like I do, or rather like I want to. How she could be so petulant and stubborn, so greedy for living, so hasty with love. I want to remember the quarters she kept for homeless men in the car she drove too fast, the oranges she pushed at my friends. I want to remember how she sniffled through movies and how pleased she was when I did too. Instead, I always think of the Friday in February when I found her face down on the floor because I'd left the room for 5 minutes to cry in the bathroom and wash my face, and the side rail collapsed, and the doctor looked at me like I'd pushed her. And that poem was initially published in the Intima, which is a journal of medical humanities. And a lot of those journals gave some of these poems their first homes. So I'm grateful for that community. I'm going to close with a poem about falling in and out of love with San Francisco during grad school. This is sun setting on San Francisco. Driving downhill, and in the distance, technicolor houses, dot mountains, seedlings emerging into flame. Sutro Tower watches over a tangerine sky, so bright and tender, I want to sink my teeth in, let it drag me down with the sun. Moments like this, I remember how I used to run until the fog burned out. Pretend I was warm as my teeth chattered so hard they cracked like a glass of water. I want to be opaque like the fog, not the water. Mostly, all I remember is fog and rain until wetness became me, washed me up and wrung me out. I never dried, just grew moldy at the cracks, skin dotted green like a half-watered lawn. My heart beneath is rotting, and everywhere I go is musty, smells like damp leaves and poison. It doesn't rain anymore, but I am made of water. Draw in moisture like a vortex. My skin is never thick enough. When the wind hits, I stand long and still. I can replace glaciers. That said, I am glad we are back to having rain. And with that, I will end there and give it back to LJ for your questions.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you for that reading. Thank you so much. I want to make a correction. I mispronounced your name and I apologize. It is Jenny Chi.
Thanks, LJ. Thanks a lot.
So I want to tell everybody who's watching, if you have questions, please submit them on the Q&A and we'll work to answer them. And on that note, let's go to questions that the audience has asked, but we're going to start with a little icebreaker for Jenny and I. Jenny, what is bringing you joy right now or lately?
I have gotten really into plants during the pandemic. And one of my good friends who actually just left UCSF, left the Bay Area in general, and I've inherited a bunch of his plants. So I'm working on settling those in. And that's been just nice to like see things growing and like remember that there's still life.
Yeah.
How about you?
Sure. You keep them alive though?
My apartment is kind of like a greenhouse because I'm on the top floor and I get a lot of sun. So the plants seem to love it. So yeah, I'm pretty lucky there. Yeah, what about you? What's been bringing you joy lately?
Yeah, also I apologize. It looks like I'm turning into a ghost, but lighting, whatever. You can still see my eyes. Gosh, I think this last rainstorm was huge. Like my neighbor and I both were in the backyard, like unbeknownst to one another. I was out there hollering when it started raining, just like whooping because I was so happy during the drought. And then I heard her over the fence whooping, and then we heard each other and we're whooping. So that just made me really happy. It did get a little insane this weekend. And our neighbor's shed roof blew off in the wind. And then we have sump pumps in the front and we were almost flooded when ours stopped and we didn't realize it. So it can get a little out of control, but I'm still happy for it, like really happy for it.
Yeah, I feel similarly.
So let's see. I'm just gonna jump to the first question that was submitted, which is, what are some of your writing inspirations in general?
A lot of things. I get a lot of inspiration from like other like books and poems that I read, and like often from I enjoy like seeing plays and just like other forms of media. There's a poem that I didn't read in this book that includes a quote from the play Arcadia by Thomas Stoppard, which I saw with my roommate in grad school. And just often exposure to other things like that. And there are also other poems in this book that like were inspired by headlines I saw and things things like that.
Cool. Yeah, that's I the same thing happens to me. Sometimes I sketch while I'm, or not sketch, but have a notebook while I'm at the movies because I get ideas like during the movie. Let's see. So someone in the audience wrote, I love the biology lesson poems. Can you share a bit about your writing of these? Were they written over time or all at once?
Thank you. I think those were written all at once, actually, or pretty close together, if not like all at once, probably within the same month. Every April, which is National Poetry Month, I do this like challenge by myself where I try to write like daily syllabics, which just means that each day I decide on like an arbitrary number of syllables for each line just to like give myself some constraints. And I write really short poems based on that. And most of those never amount to anything. It's really just to get myself to write a little bit every day and to be in that headspace. But I think when I wrote those, it was, as I mentioned, like when I was first learning cell culture and I was like learning a bunch of things about how cells behave in a dish. And but then I think the last two of those poems came out of reading like various papers for class. So probably like in the same short period.
So that kind of leads into this other question that someone else submitted, which is interesting. Do you think more scientists are poets, but may not be aware or know how to start?
Probably. Yeah, I feel like poetry isn't necessarily taught well, like in school. And so it feels like this very inaccessible thing to a lot of people. And very rarely in like K through 12 do we learn about any living poets, which tend to be more relatable and accessible to people. I mean, I think honestly, the same could be said for science sometimes, that it's not taught in a very accessible way. I do think, for me at least, a lot of what drove me to pursue a PhD rather than like go to med school is similar to what draws me to poetry. It's this sense of curiosity and the desire to like probe into like the mysteries of the universe, you know? And so I think that is something that is in a lot of scientists. And if they had an accessible way to be introduced to poetry, like, yeah, why not?
It's interesting because there's another question here which kind of leads into that strangely. The person writes, I'm curious about process. Where does a poem start for you? Thinking here along lines of feeling, image, phrase, etc., and what happens next. And I would tack onto that, is it similar to your scientific process in any way?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Okay, so I guess I'll start with the first part of that question, in terms of where a poem starts for me. I think often it just comes from like ruminating or meditating on an idea or a phrase. like often I will just have, at least when I was writing this book, I often just had like lines that came to me and I would think about them over and over. And then eventually I would sit down and like write it and like try to turn it into something, or like sometimes I had just like thought about it long enough that by the time I sat down, like a whole poem could come out. That happens sometimes. And then in terms of the scientific process, yeah, I guess I would say it's not, maybe there are some similarities in like when you're first coming up with an idea for a proposal, like, because when you're writing a proposal for a project, that comes from reading a bunch of things and then making connections between the things that you're reading. And there's like kind of a eureka moment when that happens sometimes, much like with a poem. So I think in those ways, they can be a little bit similar. Though the scientific process just takes a lot longer. And I shouldn't, and oh, I guess you already mentioned this in the beginning, but I'm not in the lab anymore. So I also don't do that anymore.
Well, so are you, what are you like currently obsessing over or that you're thinking about writing?
A few things. I'll admit first that like in this last year or so, because I've been so focused on wrapping up this book and all of the stages, which it turns out there are kind of a lot between like when this book is accepted and like when it's out in the world. I haven't really been writing that much just because it's like a different headspace that I have to be in. And also because I do have a full-time job. And so there's just not necessarily enough time to like get into that headspace. So I've actually been writing a lot more essays in this last year. Somehow that feels more accessible right now. But I guess more generally, some things that I'm working on include one is sort of like a big project that I'm working very slowly, is like translating my late mother's books. She wrote a memoir as well as a novel at the end of her life. And so I'm working on translating those. And my Chinese is not actually that great. So it's like a laborious process. And the other, I guess, like the topics that I've been kind of obsessing over lately, but I guess after grad school and before I started my current job, I worked for a couple of years in health tech at this company called Doximity. And during that time, I started like sort of trying to teach myself how to code because I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And so I was like engaging a lot with like the most basic general ideas around machine learning and reading about that. And I started to think a lot about technology and the parallels between machine learning and like human and societal learning, because of course, like we're the ones teaching machines. So what are the ways in which like that's similar or different, and how are we influencing technology in unexpected ways? So I have a poem not in this book that is titled Machine Learning and sort of delves into those topics. And I've been writing a bit about that more generally.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it makes me think about, going both ways on that, right? Because like machine learning, what we're teaching them, and then algorithms that are teaching us constantly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like part of daily life.
Mhm. Yeah, I was reading, I read something earlier in the pandemic that people were getting more facial plastic surgery because they're seeing themselves on Zoom all the time.
Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I have other questions, but I'm going to go to the questions that the audience is asking because we have limited time, and then you and I can talk anytime. So let's see. So someone had asked, how do you carve out time for writing? And you kind of answered that, like, you work on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can give a slightly more detailed answer if you want. Yeah, I guess it can definitely be challenging. I will say during grad school, like sometimes if I had like a long incubation and there wasn't enough time for me to really start something else, that could be a time when I would write things. And I usually like kept a notebook with me because sometimes just like I also during long experiments like listen to a lot of podcasts, and like sometimes those triggered ideas, and so I like might just jot things down and like write them later. Yeah, it's harder. I guess it's harder. It became a little harder when I got an office job.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, but okay. But something I did when I was working at Doximity was every day. So I walked to and from work. Uh, and instead of walking home after work, I would walk to a coffee shop, force myself to like sit there for like an hour or two and just work on writing or writing related things, because during that time I was also like submitting a lot of work and like sending this book out. As long as it had something to do with writing, I would work on that for a while before I allowed myself to go home. And so that helps, just like forcing myself into a writing space.
So you're saying it's partly discipline too.
Yes, sometimes.
Damn. Let's see. Oh, okay. Could you share more about the UCSF arts community that brought the two of you together?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So Dr. David Watts is a gastroenterologist at UCSF, and he runs this workshop like fairly informally, and it's every Monday. I want to say at 4:30. It's during the pandemic. Yeah, during the pandemic, it's been over Zoom. And I think like when I first started grad school, I would like see flyers sometimes for this, like paper flyers. But the reason I started going in my second year after I was like finished with classes and could sort of be more flexible with my schedule, was because another member of the workshop, Sarah, reached out to me and invited me to do so after I had like published a poem in Synapse, the UCSF newspaper, if folks don't know. I was also pretty involved with Synapse while I was in grad school. One of the years I was editor-in-chief. but yes, so that is a really lovely like workshop space, and people bring in both poetry and prose. I think LJ, you brought in prose sometimes. So especially if like you're starting out, I think it's like a really nurturing space.
For sure. Yeah. Sarah was the person who invited me too. She's a great recruiter for that group.
Wow.
Yeah, and I know that that Maria was in it too. Maria's read with you at your book launch, and that it was my experience. I'm not going anymore, but other students come in and come and go, and different people. There's like a core group that's kind of there all the time, and then people kind of come and go, and it's very welcoming. It's a very safe place. And then of course everyone there, because I feel like because it's at UCSF, there's a certain, and because David Watts is an MD, there's this embrace of like that crossover between the content being more related to like the health sciences or biology or the sciences, seems to crop up there. But then all kinds of people come. So yeah, it's a great, it's just a really supportive place. And one of the things that impressed me the most was how when Litquake rolls around, like everybody from that group is like there to see your reading. If you're reading, it's just like on it.
Yes, that's so true.
Yeah.
And I guess I should mention, David also teaches like a medical humanities course for medical students. And so like that workshop gets students from that class. But if you are in med school or know any med students who may be interested, quick plug for that.
Parnassus poets. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, I like this question. When will your next book come out, Jenny?
No idea. I don't even know if my next book will be poetry, to be honest, because I'm doing like my translation project. I'm like writing lots of essays. So I don't know. Short answer.
Yeah, no. Let's see. I'm curious myself about essays. Like, what attracted you to the essay form? Like, if you could describe sort of why or how you found yourself going into that form, what was it?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure. I think, well, okay. So when I was in grad school, I was really exploring like science communication because I was just like desperately trying to find some way of like combining my interest in science and writing, which is like how I got super involved with Synapse. I also like started up a podcast towards the end of grad school. Oh, I interviewed LJ for this podcast, actually. It's called Bone Lab Radio.
It's the podcast.
Very last episode, I think, because everyone else who co-started this podcast with me is still in academia, so they don't really have time. Not that any of us really have time anymore, but they were all bone researchers, and I was just like the one lone non-bone researcher SciComm person who just wanted in on it. So I did that. I like drew like science cartoons for a while. I did a bunch of things to just try to figure out some sort of niche. And I guess like in the process of like exploring science journalism, I was also starting to do some essays. And I had honestly started out in life thinking I would maybe grow up to be like a novelist on the side and not necessarily a poet. Like that was more of what I read, was actually like novels, short story collections, essay collections. And so I have a hard time driving a plot forward. So fiction was harder, but essays came a little bit more naturally. And I think the other thing is that during grad school, something I was really sort of obsessing over was, I guess, like the way in which my mother died. And so I became really obsessed with palliative care and hospice and like end of life issues.
Mhm.
And essays were sort of a natural, useful way of getting more of that information out there.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious about what you said about you have trouble driving the thought forward. Would you tell me what you mean by that? Because I find that really interesting.
Um, well, I don't know, like if you're writing a novel, there has to be a plot of some kind, but I'm
Ah,
better
I
at just
see.
like writing scenes, which is why like poems and
Yeah,
essays work, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, wow. So, I don't know if I don't think you actually covered this question, but I'm curious too. What other art forms or hobbies do you enjoy? Um, and how do they influence your writing, if at all?
Mm.
I would even tack on to that my own question, which is, do you have like a relaxation art form, the no pressure art form?
Great question. I try to make sure that like my arts and crafts things are just hobbies since I turned my writing hobby into not a hobby anymore. um, I guess I've honestly always been like a pretty like artsy crafty person. Um, my first like job that I wanted as a kid was like a visual artist slash a graffiti artist, believe it or not. I just thought that would be so cool. Or like a muralist. I guess that's what I really wanted. So I do like visual arts as well. And I kind of just, I dabble in like a lot of that. What I have gravitated towards more in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, I guess, is I make a lot of like clay things. So I work with like Sculpey clay a lot. I actually have a whole clay Instagram. And normally in
What?
October, wait, you didn't know this?
No.
Okay, I'll send it to you later.
Okay.
But just because like the username is like kind of complicated to like describe. Anyway, so I have like a whole clay Instagram, and like normally in October, like you know how other artists will do like Inktober, I do Claytober every
Yeah.
year except this year, just because I don't really have the time. Um, and you know, during the pandemic, I like picked up like watercolors again. Um, I mentioned the plants. That's not really an art, but it's definitely a hobby that takes up time. Um,
I don't know. Keeping plants alive is an art form if you ask.
Perhaps trimming them down is definitely an art form. Um, and oh, more recently, I also inherited a bunch of knitting supplies from the same friend who gave me all the plants. And at first, I told him, look, I don't knit, so I'm just going to immediately regift this to someone else who does knit. But I'll take this off your hands so you don't have to deal with it as you're moving. And like, but I have been stress knitting. So that's my thing instead of clay this month, I guess.
Awesome. Um, oh wow. This is just so cool. So this question is interesting to me, and I echo this. How do you find writers to be in community with? So that's been a big one for me, is that in grad school it was built in for me. And then uh, you know, things change. Like I was on campus more before, and then the pandemic happened, and then also I moved out of the city. And I'm wondering, I'm sure the same kind of things have happened to you, getting a full-time job being one of them. Like, how do you continue? I think what is the community of writers? What's important about having it? And then how do you find that?
I mean, that's such a great question. And I think one that I am constantly learning the answer to still. As far as like what is important about having a community of writers, I mean, I think writing can be such an isolating thing that you do, much like science, honestly, and much like grief. And so there I was in grad school with my 3 isolating things that I did. And so I think like it is so important to have a community, because they can encourage you to keep going, they can give you feedback, and just like make you feel less alone in everything. So initially, yeah, when I was in grad school, like David's group did help me so much. I think especially then, I like my grief was so fresh and I was so young that it was honestly very helpful. A lot of the folks in that group are a bit older, and so like had more experience with grief than most of my peers. And that was so valuable to me, to be in a space where I felt like people understood. Because I remember like in college, right after my mother passed away, it was like a couple weeks later, it was spring break. And I was off planning my mom's funeral, and like my friends were off on spring break. And
Oh,
like,
man.
it's like as much as they tried to be there for me, and my friends were like as supportive as they could be, but they just, hadn't been in that position, because we were all so young. So yeah, I think in a number of ways, just like having that community just like makes you feel less alone in all of your pursuits. And then your other question was how to find writers to be in community with.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great question.
Yeah, tell me the answer, I need to know.
I think I just had to like seek it out. Like, so in addition to this workshop group, I guess really towards like the end of grad school, and afterward, I started going to more writing workshops and things like that. Like last year, like right before the pandemic lockdowns, I went to Tin House. And I'm still in touch with a lot of those people. And we do like a semi-monthly like writing session together just over Zoom. And I started applying to like a lot more fellowships and things like that as I became more serious about my writing. And I do keep in touch with a lot of people from my cohort. And now I'm also a part of the San Francisco Writers Grotto, which is like a local organization of writers, after last year being a fellow with them. And they've been so supportive. I also do social media for them sometimes, like some of us swap out, and they're just like really big cheerleaders for like people in the group.
I haven't heard of them. What do they do? What's the organization?
It's just like an organization of like professional writers.
Okay.
So I would say like look it up. They have like fellowships and also just memberships. And now they're back to having like a physical space.
Got it.
So
Got it. Yeah. Well, I am getting the kind people who keep us on track are telling me it's our 5-minute warning. So last question. I saved this one. Oh, I'm gonna squeeze in two just because.
I'll try to be quick.
Where they want to know, the audience would like to know, where can we see more of your readings?
Oh, thank you so much. You can go to my website, which is jqiwriter.com. And I have an events page with all of my upcoming readings and also a lot of recordings of my previous readings are either like already up or will be up at some point. So yes, please sign up, please. And you can also email me through that. Like there's a contact form. I just started a MailChimp newsletter. I will probably only send this out like twice a year because I feel bad spamming people. But I will send out occasional updates on events through that as well.
And
So
on that page, people can see where they can get your book.
Also on my website.
Okay.
There's a books page. So yeah, that's jqiwriter.com.
And I really like this question. What are you reading right now?
Okay, I guess I can't really say that I'm actively reading because I just got my copy of Victoria Chang's Dear Memory, and I'm really excited about that. So Victoria Chang is this amazing poet. I'm such a fangirl. And her last book, Obit, was a book of poems that also dealt with the loss of her mother as well as her father's dementia and just like navigating that while also bringing life into the world. And she wrote this as a series of obituaries to various things that were lost.
Wow.
So that was amazing. Loved it. Got a lot of critical acclaim. And her newest book is I guess more of a hybrid, like book of essays and letters that she wrote as she was like cleaning out her parents' things. I'm such a Victoria Chang fangirl.
Great. Yeah, no, I have a huge stack and I kind of read. I'm just curious, do you read one book at a time or do you read a bunch of books at the same time?
I read a bunch at the same time. Oh, so the other thing I am also reading right now is War and Peace because I got roped into this like War and Peace like book club by Maria.
That's awesome.
So yeah, those are a couple of the things.
You're inspiring me to go back and read like Finnegan's Wake or something really called like hard to read.
You can join us in reading War and Peace. It's actually like part of a public place, and it's this whole thing.
Ooh, I'm tempted. Well, it looks like we're almost done. So I want to give my props and say thank you before things are over. Thank you to the audience that I can't see, but I know you're there. Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing your work and for sharing about your work and taking the time to chat. Thank you to all the alumni for your outstanding questions. And I think we're going to be ending the evening here. I hope everybody has a great night and I'll see you in War and Peace.
Thank you so much, LJ.
Take care.